This is Sovereign Debt, a podcast on greening the global economy and debt sustainability. I'm your host, Jill Doshi. Hello, everyone. We have been talking a lot about debt for nature swaps, and in particular, the transaction in Belize. We have heard from Jen Morris and Kevin Bender of the Nature Conservancy, and we are aware of other podcasts that have spoken to the lawyers involved. And even I was a guest on Mitu Galati and Mark Wiedemeyer's fabulous podcast, Clauses and Controversies, to talk about the deal. But in all of those conversations, we have yet to hear the voices from Belize. And today's guest is to give us that new perspective. Julie Robinson is a marine biologist and the program director for the Nature Conservancy's Belize program, where she has worked for almost 15 years. She's from Belize and grew up, as I understand, next to the coast, which has fueled her passion for marine conservation. And I would like to add that she is also the one that should really get the credit for this deal. So Julie, first of all, thank you so much for being with us today. And congratulations on this amazing achievement. And I hope you got some well-deserved rest over the holidays.
Thank you, Jill. It was amazing. And but first of all, I really have to say that, it's the credit goes to so many people. There's just amazing teams behind this deal. And, whereas I led the negotiations here with government, it was really it was all hands on deck. And, without everybody, including yourself, we wouldn't be here today. So, I think it's really congratulations to everybody for this amazing achievement. And thank you for having me on here. It's exciting to be able to talk about this some more.
No, it's great. And before we get into the Belize transaction, first of all, I just want to back up to one point in your bio. You've been with TNC for 15 years. That alone is amazing and deserves credit. But we've understood from all of our other conversations and what we've read about TNC in Belize that the Nature Conservancy has been there for, I think it's now 30 years. Working with the government and particularly the people of Belize. So maybe as a first step, can you tell us a little bit about your programs in the country and your role in them?
The Nature Conservancy, we've been working. We first opened up our doors in Belize over 30 years ago, and it's been a wonderful experience to have been a part of that for as long as I have. And one of the things that sort of resonated throughout our 30-year history is really the long-standing partnerships that we've had on the ground here in Belize, not only with government, but also with our non-government partners, with communities, and even with the private sector. In addition to like all the science and the conservation efforts that we've done both on land and at sea, one of the big things that TNC has always been focused on is really building permanent capacity in the country. And, some of our oldest and most well-established local NGOs really started off with TNC assisting to build them and to build a board and to provide training and to build organizations. And we see it today. There's just a plethora of NGOs that are working towards sustainable development of the country. Because of this, because we've worked so much on that, building that capacity, I'd say that, we've had a very light presence in the country. Today, our team consists, including myself, of 7 people. We've never had more than 7 people working in the country in all of that time. We have 4 national level programs, both marine and terrestrial. And the only way we can have sort of the impact that we're having, with such a small team is through these partnerships, where we work to achieve this shared vision. So it's as much as it's about nature and conservation, it's about people. And it's about creating an enabling environment for people to be able to manage the resources in a sustainable way. And that's been the focus. And I guess a little bit more background here is Belize is a really small country, both in population and geography. So there's 420,000 people roughly in the country. So what that does is it creates an incredible opportunity for really strong synergies, really strong connections, and working together really well. And I think that's really been the basis for our work in Belize. And to have been a part of that for half of its history has just been incredible.
That's amazing, Julie. For all of the hours that we've spent together on Zoom and otherwise, I don't think I've ever realized that your team was so small. I mean, that's amazing how you've then leveraged that, like you say, to the local communities.
Yeah, and I think a part of that too is just I like to call them, it's our tiny but mighty team. And there's a lot of passion, a lot of dedication to getting the work done and to working with people. And so that's really been, I think, the key to success here. And it's what we continue to strive forward as we're implementing new programs. And so I think it's been a great recipe for success, and we'll just keep using it.
Oh, that's amazing. And we're going to get into kind of the details of the transaction. But first, I just, again, kind of thinking of this 30-year history that the Nature Conservancy has had in Belize. You've obviously been witness to the ups and downs of Belize's, let's say, relationship with the international capital markets, to kind of as a euphemism.
Yes.
I mean, it's no secret that Belize has been what we call a serial defaulter. How has that affected, or how has, let's say, the debt challenges in Belize affected conservation from your perspective? I mean, maybe not all of our audience knows, but Belize was actually one of the early debt for nature swaps already, kind of the one supported by the United States through the TFCA. So obviously you've been involved in the kind of debt issues before as an organization, but how have you seen this kind of constraint or this debt burden affect conservation over the years?
Well, Belize being a small country, being a developing nation, we've always struggled. I guess you could say we've always been cash strapped. And the super bond, which was the single commercial debt that we had, was $550 million, was really a huge burden on the country. It prevented government from investing in sustainable development and also cutting corners and things like that where it needed to. Whereas the country has always had this strong desire to sustainably develop, and that has always been at the forefront, the government just didn't necessarily have the financial resources to be able to do that. Yeah, so it's always been difficult for government to be able to manage our resources in a sustainable way, because it was always there was never enough funds to be able to actually have a functional budget. So this has been one of the issues. And while we have really good laws in place, we've got extensive protected areas on land. 40% of our land is protected, and almost 15% of our oceans is currently protected. So we've got really great regulations, but what we've lacked have been the financial resources to be able to implement these regulations, to enforce these regulations, to monitor and put people and equipment on the ground and on the water to ensure that our resources are being managed in a sustainable way. So the burden of the debt has really limited, government's ability to be able to manage things well. And when I think about conservation, it's not just about protection, it's about management. And this is one of the things that I'm just, really passionate about, because Far too often, people talk about protection and locking things up and conserving it and just keeping it just in one little space. That is absolutely important. There's science behind it that tells us why we need to have a minimum of 30% of habitats protected. But there's no point in having that protection if there's no management on the ground and making sure that is actually being implemented. And so that has been the problem that we have had here in Belize. And the debt burden has contributed incredibly towards that, not to mention more recently, pandemic. 40% of our GDP comes from tourism. It literally disappeared overnight. The entire country went into a lockdown. Land borders were closed. The one international airport was closed. And, it was, we were in an economic crisis. So also within all the protected areas managers, so not just government, but we also have nonprofit protected areas managers, NGOs, their income also came to a halt because people were no longer visiting the parks. Nobody was coming into the country. So there was just this knock-on effect. And to be able to restructure that debt, which represented like over 25% of our GDP, was that just that debt? So to be able to restructure that is going to create this incredible fiscal space for both government as well as the non-government community to really to improve and invest more in sustainable management of our protected areas and our natural resources.
So when I hear you, it seems like a debt for nature swap, this kind of conversion transaction is kind of a no-brainer for Belize. Did it feel that way at the time on the ground within Belize government and just even more broadly in the population? Was this how did this come about from your perspective? Like, was this something that the Belize government had been thinking about and discussing with TNC for a long time? Or was this really in response to the pandemic and just kind of like, we're at the end of our rope, we have to do something really radically different? How did it come about?
I'll tell two versions of this. Well, not two versions, but there's two parts to the story. First and more immediately, we started discussions with government in June of 2020. And then in November, we had general elections. And during the general elections, the government switched. So the opposition came into power and the existing government then became the opposition. So when we started these discussions, we started it with the now opposition party. It was absolutely a no-brainer. Country was in, economic crisis. We had looming payments coming as part of the super bond debt, and something needed to be done. And so we were able to present a solution to that. November came, government changed. We waited a bit for the dust to settle and then picked things right back up in December. And then less than a year after that, we closed the deal. So that's just a short version of this story. But I think what I do want to share is provide a little bit more historical context, which is, and you mentioned it earlier. So back in 2001, TNC worked with the then government of Belize to do the very first debt for nature swap, and that was under the Tropical Forest Conservation Act. And that was a sovereign to sovereign debt with the United States. So that kind of paved the way, and that opened up areas for discussion around debt restructuring. And later on, and I believe like it was around, if I remember correctly, it was 2010, 2011, we again engaged with the government on a potential debt restructure for climate adaptation deal. This was a much smaller deal that we were working on, very different from what we just accomplished with the Blue Bonds program. And there were some very smaller deal. It was also based on raising philanthropic funds. And it did not have the backing, for example, of like DFC. So there were lots of things that were very, very different. It was just not as sophisticated as what we've just accomplished. We negotiated with government on this deal for 4 years, and we were never able to close the deal. It was there was, and I firmly believe that everything happens in its own time. It wasn't the time to do it then, so it didn't happen. However, what happened was all the lessons that we had learned from Belize and from those negotiations that we were working on got taken over to the Seychelles for the first Blue Bonds deal. And it was improved from what we were trying to do in Belize. We were successful in the Seychelles in 2016. And then after that, the lessons that were learned from the Seychelles then got brought right back to Belize in 2020. So there's just, it's just this cycle and this full circle. And when we brought it back, that was the time to do it. So it wasn't, so the early discussions, when it was a very different structure, it was not a no-brainer. It was there was a lot of opposition to that. However, once we started the discussions, or in June of 2020, then everybody was on board. It was very, very clear that this needed to happen. This was going to be a solution to the issues facing the country, and would also provide these additional benefits of cash flows to marine conservation in perpetuity. So it was a no-brainer.
No, that's really interesting that there's this kind of there was a learning curve for both, it sounds, TNC as well as the Belize government and all the parties in Belize, and just kind of understanding the process. And as you described, having debated it for many years, an earlier structure, and then seeing how it was implemented elsewhere, and then lessons learned. I mean, that's a really powerful story for this, and then also kind of gives hope for the question of, can this be replicated and scaled for other places, in the sense that we'll learn lessons from this transaction that we can take forward elsewhere.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the beauties about this, is that every single time we do a deal like this, we learn something new, and we improve on it. It's adaptive management, and then it makes the next one hopefully a little bit easier.
That's our hope. And that's part of the reason why we're doing this podcast as well, is to kind of share these lessons and hopefully just stimulate these conversations in other countries. But I want to turn to the transaction a little bit. Our audience, mainly debt managers and policymakers, as far as I understand, and they're mainly focused, I think, on the sovereign debt side of things. But I think people who are listening are also extremely curious about the conservation impact. And we've heard of the Marine Spatial Plan. We've heard of some of the conservation trust that is, you just mentioned it, that will be created to fund conservation in perpetuity. Could you tell us a little bit about that more, like kind of demystify what is the conservation impact, and is it real? And what is exactly the Marine Spatial Plan? If I know this is like probably something you could talk about for hours and hours, but just if you can kind of simplify it for people who aren't necessarily in the conservation world, that are more kind of like, let's say, sovereign debt nerds, what is the conservation outcome here?
Sure. So let me answer the question around marine spatial planning first. MSP, so that's the marine spatial planning. I mean, this is really a tool that's used sort of around the world to improve ocean management, both for nature and for people. So it's a participatory process. It's a public process. It's led by the government, where all users of the ocean space are actually brought to the table to plan how are they going to utilize the space going forward. How do we avoid conflicts? How do we make the best use of opportunities? It's based on science, it's based on information and whatever local knowledge that's brought to the table. And at the end of the day, what we have is just a clear plan for how we're going to manage that ocean space. And this will be done for the entire our entire ocean all the way out to the EEZ. And so that's, in 30 seconds, kind of what a marine spatial plan is. And it will be adaptable, and it will be that is part of one of the major conservation commitments or major milestones that's within the commitments.
And TNC is doing that then with government and presumably other parties.
So TNC will be providing the technical expertise. And as we've done in the past with all the other organizations, we're building the capacity, of permanent capacity for government departments to actually do this work themselves and lead it themselves. We will only be there as facilitators and to come in with whatever technical expertise is necessary. But MSPs, they need to be owned by the country, by the people. And so they're government led, and it's really going to be driven by the information and what all the various users bring to the table. And for TNC, we will just be facilitating that process.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
On the conservation fund, so there were two parts to this deal. One was the Blue Loan Agreement, which was the debt restructure itself, and then the other was a conservation financing agreement. So within the conservation financing agreement, government committed to paying on average $4.2 million per year over a 20-year period that will go towards this conservation fund. Now, the conservation fund we are currently in the process of establishing that. It will be an independent entity, non-government majority, and it will be a charitable organization, so 501c3 registered in the United States, but also registered in Belize. It will be staffed by Belize, and it will operate in Belize. And the purpose for this fund is really to accept the payments from the government and channel those to conservation initiatives on the ground. That ultimately will also assist government to meeting the milestones within the agreement. So at this point in time, what we're doing is we have started a stakeholder engagement process, because this conservation fund is going to be built from the bottom up. It's not TNC and it's not government that is going to determine the governance structure and how this is working. This is actually being determined by the stakeholders. So, for example, just last week, we held our first workshop where we had 115 participants that we knew of. Others were streaming in live on Facebook, and we don't know how many people were actually participating through that medium. But at the end of the first workshop, what we had the composition for the board, and that was done through a polling process that where everybody voted for who the members of that board should be. So, for example, the composition of the board is being determined through the stakeholder engagement process. And it's a 9-member board. We will have, there's 4 seats for government, which includes the Minister of Finance, Minister of Blue Economy, Minister of Sustainable Development, and a bipartisan seat, which is wonderful. No conservation funds that I know of anywhere in the world include a bipartisan seat. And the whole purpose for having this there is to ensure continuity, regardless of which party is in power or is in government.
That's brilliant.
It's incredible.
I mean, sitting here in Washington, D.C., I can't even imagine such a thing, but that's amazing.
Yeah, and the beauty about this is that this was voted on by stakeholders. And when I say, and it was open. This was, it was an open session, fully accountable and transparent. And people are saying, okay, this is really the governance structure that they feel we need. And then there's going to be 5 non-government seats. TNC will have one of those seats. There is the Belize network of NGOs, which is really, they represent multiple sectors, multiple nonprofit sectors within the country. So they will also have a seat. The fishery sector will have a seat. The tourism sector will have a seat. And academia will have a seat. And so this board will really be the ones that manage that $4.2 million per year that will be coming in, and ensuring that it's channeled towards conservation on the ground. So of those funds, a lot of thought went into this. And again, this is groundbreaking, hasn't been done anywhere else before. In the negotiating with government, it was decided, and actually I'm quite proud that we're able to do this, is that we established a 40% government strategic allocation, meaning that 40% of that 4.2 million will go back to government to ensure that they have the permanent capacity, they have the people in place, they have the boats or the fuel, the equipment, whatever they need to be able to implement the milestones that are in the financing agreement. Without those resources, they won't be able to achieve that. They won't be able to lead the marine spatial planning process, for example. And then the balance of the money will, 40% of that will go towards a grants awards program, which community-based organizations, nonprofit organizations, private sector will all have access to. And then a cap, an absolute cap of 20% will be for administration of the fund. We anticipate it'll be much less than that. And so this is sort of the structure which we're going to be moving forward with, and there will be grant cycles, annual grant cycles, and allocations to both government and non-government and private sector as we go forward over the next 20 years, and ensuring that really it's not only about, like I said, protection, but it's also about sustainable management and making sure that we are first and foremost achieving our goals, but then we're also supporting everything, blue economy, biodiversity, protection, sustainable management of fisheries and aquaculture, and tackling climate change. So these are all things that will be included as part of that program.
It sounds really comprehensive in the sense of that you've got a lot of voices of the stakeholders in here, which actually kind of preempts my next question. I was going to be asking about implementation, but I think you've almost already answered it, in the sense I was going to be kind of challenging you and saying, if I'm really obnoxious and being devil's advocate, is this all just smoke and mirrors and a giant PR stunt for Belize to get debt relief? But hearing you even just describe this, I think I know your answer to the question already, is that it is being implemented and does have a high chance of success. I mean, is that your perspective? And are you hearing these kind of naysayers criticizing the deal? And what do you say to them?
Jill, I have not heard a single naysayer. It's been amazing. Yeah, no, it's been amazing. I would say early on, before we closed the deal, before all the information was out there was absolutely skepticism. People did not know the details of the deal. They did not know what was being negotiated. They didn't know how the funds would be used. There were so many questions, but because of the sensitivities and the confidentiality behind this deal, we weren't able to say anything. And so, of course, as you can imagine, all that did was it created even more skepticism. It's like, well, what are you guys up to? What are you doing? It's like, you're selling off our reef. And it's like, TNC. And so there was a lot of rumors flying around. A close colleague of mine sort of looked at me because being Belizean, sitting, living, breathing, being here in Belize, it was really difficult to hear all these rumors and not respond. Close colleague and legal counsel essentially told me, it's like, Julie, can you put up with 3 months of rumors for a lifetime of conservation? And I'm like, yeah, you know what? I think I can do that. I'm just going to ignore everything. And then we closed the deal. We closed the deal on November 4th of last year. And we immediately started releasing all the information, started having interviews, sharing everything. And the more that people engaged and the more that they heard, the more they bought into the idea. And all of that, all the doubts, all the skepticism, everything transformed to praises, kudos, thank yous, and really appreciating the transparency that we were putting into the process of it, especially in developing this conservation fund, because there's a lot of doubt around that. So it's been incredibly rewarding for me, and it was also a lesson in patience.
Absolutely. No, and I remember those tough moments in between because I wasn't even sitting in Belize, but I was like, can't we say something? Can we? Can't we? And like you said, there was very strong advice just to let the process be and let the transaction close and and I agree. Since then, there has been just so much enthusiasm and questions and wanting people wanting to learn about this transaction to see how they can replicate it and take these lessons elsewhere. So it's super exciting, which kind of tees me up for my last question and to give you kind of the last comments. What advice would you give to others who are interested in this sort of transaction? And by others, I'm meaning really anyone, the government officials, either in conservation or in finance, that is looking at this deal and thinking, how can I do this for my country? Or even other stakeholders working in conservation who are, some of these organizations, similar to what you have in Belize that are working on the ground and wanting to affect change. How can they make this happen? What advice would you give to them, or even what pitfalls to avoid? What would you like to say to them?
Having one point of contact within government is absolutely key, and also within TNC. And so that was part of what this deal was about. Was essentially there was a lot of negotiation, a lot of back and forth when things got really difficult. As you know, there were times when we thought, okay, are we really going to achieve this or not? It essentially came down to two people, one on TNC side, one on government side. So identifying, first of all, my advice would be identifying those people, the people who are going to lead the way and be that point of contact and negotiate when things get really difficult. I think reaching out to various partners. I think so. For other governments, I think reach out to Belize government, reach out to Ministry of Finance or the Office of the Prime Minister. Have these bilateral discussions. That is one way in which other governments can learn so much about what Belize went through and the process, and learn from any pitfalls that there might have been. Reaching out to groups, such as yourself, who could help to navigate and provide advice on these very complicated strategies and debt restructuring. I mean, having you at the table and providing that advice was just so important for us to be able to get to where we are today. So, absolutely reaching out for that kind of advice. Within TNC, there's a naturefest at tnc.org. It's a generic email, but it's a good place to start. But there's a lot of information also readily available on the website at nature.org that talks about the Blue Bonds program and what it is, what it isn't, who to contact, how to find out more. These are some of the things that, I would definitely advise to anybody who is interested in doing something similar. I mean, we are looking at multiple countries right now to see how we can, how we can do this all over again, but even better. So there's definitely a ton of opportunity out there.
No, that's great, because that's the trick, right? We need to try to, and the clock is ticking, and we need to try to figure out how to take these lessons learned and apply them in as many places as we can to bring about the conservation as well as the debt relief.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. It's just, at the end of the day, it's the one limiting factor that I think all governments are facing when it comes to conservation and sustainable management of natural resources is really just a lack of financial, lack of finances, lack of financial resources. So here is a solution where we can provide cash flows for conservation and alleviate that burden.
Well, that's great. Well, we hope to keep you very busy in the future. So, and thank you so much, Julie, for your time and for all that you've done to make this deal a success. Thank you so much.
No, thanks, Jill. It's been an amazing journey. It's been and now we get to reap the benefits here. So I'm thrilled. So thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. And one programming note, we're going to be releasing episodes every other week going forward. So please be sure to subscribe to the podcast feed to stay up to date.